Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Book Talks at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Where am I? I'm in Pittsburgh, at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. This is an event co-hosted by the Barbour Library and the Center for Writing and Learning Support at the seminary. My name is Shan Overton, and I'm the director of the Writing Center at the seminary, and I'm here with my colleague who's in the background. You won't see her necessarily today, although her picture is on the screen. Michelle Spomer, who's the head of Barbour Library. She is behind the scenes to help us take your questions to make sure that we're able to pose those to Joanne, our guests, as we come to the question and answer session. Additionally, Michelle is putting up links in the chat that you might want to look at. One of them is a link to our library's library guide, also known as a LibGuide, that Michelle has put together with guidance from Joanne about resources that you can access, so that if you'd like to explore more about trauma-informed yoga or other aspects of our discussion after we complete today, you might consult the library's website and check that out. Another link that will be included in what Michelle is putting in the chat for you is a link to City Books, which is a local bookstore here in Pittsburgh, working with us to help provide you with books like Joanne's book. We hope that you will give them a call if you're in Pittsburgh. They are not taking walk-ins at this time, but they will be happy to do curbside delivery for you. Additionally, City Books has provided a site on bookshop.org that is a collaborative site with us in order to feature Joanne's books and other books in the Book Talk series. So we hope if you'd prefer to order online, you might go there and check out bookshop.org. So those links will remain there for the entirety of the program, and we'll remind you about them again at the end in case you'd like to make use of them. So I want to thank, as we begin to start, thank the PTSIT department, including Tyler Mumau, who is here behind the scenes making sure that the ship doesn't crash while we're at sail. I also want to thank our communications department, Melissa Logan and Robin Menard, for helping us with this, and also express gratitude for the support of our Dean of Faculty, Heather Vosick, who supports Book Talks as well. Now, for those of you who are interested in asking some questions of Joanne Spence after we get started, you'll see in the bottom of your screen a button that says Q&A, and we'd invite you to put the questions that you might have in the Q&A, and Michelle will help me moderate those so that we can put those before Joanne, so she can speak a little bit to the things that you think are important that you'd like to know more about. So today, I want to just say I have been waiting for this moment for, I don't know, at least a couple of years. I am so pleased to welcome Joanne Spence for the book launch of her really, really wonderful book. As you can see it behind her, but I'm going to hold up my copy because I have a copy. It's all marked up and everything to prove I read it. Trauma-Informed Yoga, a Toolbox for Therapists. And it has a longer title than that, but we'll get into that later about the practices. So Joanne Spence, and I'm seeing in the chat a lot of yays and claps from people. So you're getting cheers, Joanne, all over the place already. Joanne Spence is a member of the board of directors of the seminary. She is a graduate of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and also teaches yoga classes and offers retreats at the seminary. And this is in addition to all the other stuff that she does. So I just want to say she is a well-known friend to the seminary, and she's also my own yoga teacher. So I have a bias here as well. And I'm very excited to get to talk to her about her book because I get to take her classes every week. So this book, Trauma-Informed Yoga, a Toolbox for Therapists, is selling like hotcakes according to Amazon on several different lists, which is just an incredible thrill. And I wanted to read a couple of blurbs from this just so you get a sense of the varied people that have made comments here. This is from Amy Wheeler, professor of kinesiology at California State University, San Bernardino, past president of the International Association of Yoga Therapists, who says, Joanne Spence has written a magnificent book for mental health care providers, yoga students, and teachers, as well as certified yoga therapists. And indeed, she's right. This is a magnificent book. Also from the Reverend Dr. Joan Prentice, also on the board of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary and the founder and executive director of the Ephesus Project. Dr. Prentice says, Joanne skillfully presents research and science that inform the positive outcomes of trauma-informed yoga and make it inspiring. It should be recommended reading for anyone who works in helping professions and healing ministries, including spiritual directors, spiritual leaders, pastors, and therapists. All of this and more is true, and the blurbs themselves could tell you. So get the book just to read the blurbs because they're pretty awesome. Joanne, welcome and congratulations on your wonderful book. I'm so excited for you. Instead of me talking a lot about what the book is about, I wanted to just start out and ask you to talk with the audience some about what your book is about and why you felt this book was needed at this time.
Thank you, Sharon. It's wonderful to be here. And yeah, I wrote the book because I felt there was a knowledge gap. And it, on one level, the practices that I presented in the book are very basic and very elementary. And sometimes, especially when you've been practicing something for 20 years, it's easy to think that everybody knows what you know. And I've learned from working in psychiatric facilities and in juvenile detention centers. And I think you even said sometimes on street corners or my own backyard. I realize that it's not intuitive to everybody how to breathe and what movement, and even very gentle movement, what it can do to shift the state of the nervous system. And I thought, well, what if I actually wrote those things down and we kind of closed that gap between the knowing and the doing? And so that was my attempt to do that. And I thought not only did it need to have really clear scripts that someone could actually read and do for themselves, or read and teach that and do it with somebody else, as in the context of talk therapy, I really wanted to expand some of the science behind that. And I decided that Polyvagal Theory was a really good lens to look through. And then my experience of 20 years of immersing in yoga learning, so ancient practices, and to really focus on practice and how to. So it's a how-to manual. Some people, I mean, I really did target it for therapists, but I'm finding that it's got a wider audience as well. There is a chapter for yoga teachers in particular, because I'm making a case for all teaching being trauma-informed and having that as a universal practice, and just having some basic understanding of the anatomy of the nervous system, and a little bit of knowledge in that sense goes a long way. So, but that said, other people are saying that they've taken the practices and done them for themselves, whether or not they were in therapy or whether or not they had a yoga practice, and that they were simple enough to follow along. So I'm delighted for those peripheral audiences, and I'm really glad. And that was my sense, but when you're doing anything, you have to try and narrow in and focus on who your actual audience is. So.
And, you know, that was so interesting for me because I'm not, you know, I'm not a therapist and I'm not a yoga teacher, but as I was reading it, I was like, well, this book is for me too. You know, like there was a sense in which I could take what you're offering in the book, and if I follow it, if I work through the practices and understand a little bit behind them, that, you know, in my own daily life, it could be transformative. Mm-hmm. And in one place you say in the book that it's sort of an opportunity for self-study, which I think is very, very helpful. Like the materials in the back of the book would allow somebody to take self-inventories as well as if you're a therapist or you're a person working in counseling or pastoral counseling, you could use those with your clients. But at the same time, I mean, this could be for any of us, which is probably why you've been #1 on some of the Amazon lists lately, because people can see that relevance to their own lives. I'm interested in this focus on trauma-informed and trauma, because I think that sets a stage for kind of where we are in society. At one point you talk about, or quote somebody talking about, yoga as a lifestyle medicine for chronic conditions within our culture. And to me, that, you know, the backdrop of that is all of the stresses and strains we've been under, even pre-pandemic. So could you talk a bit about the trauma, you know, how you focused on trauma in designing this kind of practice, how you see that, kind of where the background comes from on that in terms of thinking about approaching work this way, even with people who do not self-identify as people who have a history of trauma.
Yeah. A clinical psychologist friend who is an early reader said one of the things that she really liked about the approach was that many of the people that she sees in her practice sometimes don't know that they have trauma in their past. And some of the numbers are bearing out, or the prevalence of trauma would suggest that in a class of 20 people, you could have 4 or 5 people that could have trauma in their past. So I'm making an argument for having this basic understanding of, and I'm using trauma in its very broadest sense of something that could overwhelm an incident or an event that has overwhelmed your present capacity to cope. And so it's more than that, and what the practices I'm suggesting don't make somebody a trauma therapist. However, it helps us to look through the lens of trauma-informed care of what we might be seeing in front of us, whether it be in a yoga class or as a therapist, or when we see the deer in the headlight glaze. And I'm sorry, I've got people in different countries that wouldn't know what deer in the headlight is, but they're staring at you, or they're in a freeze state, or somebody that's going into collapse. And to be able to identify that these are states in the nervous system, and that someone might not know why they're in these particular states, and that there are some practices that that I have seen that have come through the years of being a yoga teacher in these many different settings, mostly mental health settings, that help somebody in the moment when they're in a fight and flight, when they're in a collapse stage, to be able to move from that state. And that might sound a little paradoxical because these things happen under conscious awareness. But what we've learned is that with practice, we can, in fact, have some influence over the nervous system. So these things can be happening whether or not we know we have trauma. But sometimes they come up, and they come up often enough, even in clinical practice settings. Now, I've seen a skewed population of people when I'm working in an inpatient psychiatric setting, because people are in an acute phase of mental illness. So it stands to reason that I'm seeing people at a skewed end of the spectrum. So I really had to dig deep to figure out from my yoga practice what skills I could apply that I had learned in yoga, the practices that I learned, where did they best meet the people that I was seeing for the nearly 10 years that I worked at Western Psychiatric Institute in clinic. So it became necessary I was working in that setting before I really understood what trauma-informed was. And that's when I decided to get more education from places like, I've got mentors and teachers on the call today from Life Force Yoga, from Amy Weintraub, who also wrote the foreword to my book, and started to learn how the practices can meet someone. We call it meeting the mood in Life Force Yoga, of what we could do that would be helpful to someone and not unhelpful, so that we could follow that rule of at first doing no harm. And that quote that you mentioned about the lifestyle medicine, I was actually quoting somebody else, a very well-known yoga researcher who's on the call, Dr. Satbir Khalsa. And I was drawing from his body of research as these yoga practices are an antidote and are a way of, I'm going to say, an antidote to 21st century living and the ailments that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I liked that. At one point, I think this was in your intro, you said an antidote to living life in the fast lane, which is very, I mean, I was reading that going, yes. I mean, it really is. For those who are on the webinar who are practitioners, you do have a whole section on the basic features of this approach to yoga for practitioner therapists. And, just a couple of them include things like inviting people and giving them choices, considering the context and knowing your people, and things like that. So can you talk a little bit about how this might be different from other modalities that people might use, as an orientation for therapists, as well as other practitioners who might want to use this approach?
Yeah, so I'm going to quote from well-known book, The Body Keeps the Score, from Bessel van der Kolk, and he says that there are some things that can't be talked out. So we tend to, cognitive behavioral therapies, or therapy in general, tends to be focused on our cognitive functions, our ability to speak in the language, that exchange that happens. And if we draw the lens a little bit wider in somatics or body work, or understanding that there are multiple ways to know things. And so this is these practices are tapping into the broader sense of communication and how we know things that sometimes go beyond cognitive capacity. Doing these practices is not an intellectual exercise, it's a whole body exercise. And doesn't mean that your brain's not involved, it just means that there's more to knowing than just what we think about. And so if we can kind of land in that space, realizing that words are important, but they're not everything. There are some things that go deeper than words. And I subscribe to that school of thought that trauma is stored in the body. And it's been part of my own healing journey. So it's probably first of all, my felt experience, or my lived experience of being in talk therapy for a long time, and it's been a very helpful modality for me, and understanding that I needed something more. And my own yoga practice and being a yoga teacher has helped guide me into finding places of healing. And it's from that place of realizing, oh, we're onto something here. So it's out of that place of experience of realizing we have to move our bodies to heal.
Mm-hmm. And that was something, helpful to me about the book, is to think about yoga as this unification of body, mind, and breath together, which you sort of point out as this mind-body connection that allows us to become more aware of the totality of ourselves and exert personal agency and, control over our lives when we don't feel that we have control, or in the past we haven't had control. And that also, it's breath involved in that is not only connective in terms of mind body, but it's also a connector in terms of people as well, that we all have to breathe, and we're all sharing the air. So that to me was really helpful to think about yoga in that way. and to see myself as doing something that was a group, not only individual, but also a group exercise in a way, like a way of co-regulating, as you put it, in the more, I guess, scientific terms. I don't know if that's right or not, but the ways that we share the space, and people who are able to be non-anxious presences in that space are helpful to everyone. And this is a method for doing that. Could you talk a little bit more about polyvagal theory, which you noted just a few moments ago, which is the science behind this particular approach? And again, you know, we have people from all over the world. I forgot to note earlier, and I am going to let you speak, Joanne, but I just wanted to say Australia, Canada, Ecuador, and the UK, welcome. We're thrilled you're here. And also, hello. And also California, Wisconsin, New York, Florida, New Jersey, Virginia, North Carolina, Massachusetts, Arizona, and Maryland, as well as Pennsylvania. So we've got all of these people here, some of whom will be therapists and scientists, and some will not. So the polyvagal theory for the most of us, the broad middle, can you give us a little bit of a sense of that?
Yeah, I'm going to take an out and an in on that. And the out would be, if you have time to read the 10 or 11 pages that I wrote and labored over it, because there's a lot to it. But if we look at it's about the autonomic nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system is really the foundation of our lived experience. So that's the part of us that is either clear and focused in ventral vagal. It's the part of us that might be mobilized. I'm ready to fight or flight when we're energized about something, or we're upset, stressed about something, or the part that's maybe the lesser known that I really wanted to highlight was the collapsing part, the disappearing part, that may well have been an adaptive survival mechanism that helped us get through a really deep trauma, that maybe we were fearful for our lives, or indeed thought that life was over. So there's those three states. And I drew on the work of Dr. Steve Porges, who originated that theory in 1994. And there's been several people. Deb Dana is one of the people that I looked at her work as a therapist and how she applied that. And she really brought that into the therapeutic world and helped us understand that there is a biological need for connection when we're in that ventral vagal state, that state of being focused and clear. And what Steve Porges said about that was that the breath, so this is how it relates to the practice, is the breath provides a direct access to be able to provide a shift in the states. And between that social engagement or the sympathetic system, the fight or flight, or that collapsing in the dorsal vagal. And that's where I wanted to land that we have a way, probably not when you're in the midst of a crisis, but if we take outside of that and use them as practices, we can better understand if yoga is about self-care and self-awareness in its very basic form, of course it's more than that, but we can become more aware when we're going into a fight and flight, or when we might be disappearing into collapse, and have the awareness to be able to make a shift. So that's really kind of the and I probably would be remiss if I didn't mention the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve that the theory is named after, Polyvagal Theory. The vagal part is the vagus nerve, which is the 10th cranial nerve, and it starts all the way up in the medulla, and it goes all the way through the body and touches on many of the major organs. And it's something that because the vagus nerve innervates all of these different places in the body, and yoga has something to say about breath, that this is a way to tone the vagus nerve. So it's a lot more than that, but that's kind of a little bit of the lay of the land. And the people that are really into, there's plenty of nerdy people on the call that that have a lot more knowledge than I do on this, but it's a good starting place to understand the importance of the autonomic nervous system. The breath helps us to access that. And when we are aware of these things happening, we can apply practice to create shifts in our state or to help maintain our sense of self in the moment, because trauma is a place often when we get stuck, when we're actually safe in the moment and the trauma is long gone and the nervous system doesn't recognize that. So we can use practices to bring us into the present moment, to know that we are safe in a given moment and have the felt experience of that. So how is that for a short, long answer?
I'm like, right on. I mean, that's helping me a lot. And I mean, the book, that chapter, I know because you and I talked about this while you were working on the book, that this was one you really wrestled with, this chapter, because it is a comprehensive and really complicated theory, and a lot of research has been done. And I think you did such a great job of distilling it for those of us who are not, experts by any means. And also you provide resources so that if people wanted to go read more deeply in it, we can do that as well. Now we are getting some questions coming in, and I appreciate those. But before we get to audience questions, Joanne, I'd like to ask you, since we've been talking about how breath can shape kind of our experience of awareness and our experience of our own bodies and where we are, would you be willing to lead us in a couple of practices and talk us through it just a little bit to explain what they're doing?
Well, sure. And that's why it's great to be able to have breath practices and chair yoga practices so that you can do them at any time, any place. So there's two things that I call part of the foundational principles. The first two are linking breath to movement. And so we'll just do a short practice that helps us to do that. And the second thing is moving in our pain-free range of motion, whatever that is. Easier said than done if you have chronic pain, but it helps to really keep us in a place of moving slowly, because that in itself is a practice. So let's just try some lateral arm movements. And for me, it's still always a surprise of when we slow down and when we do those two things, link the breath to the movement and move only in our pain-free range of motion, that we do become more aware of how we're doing in the present moment, and we feel differently rather than preoccupation or being stuck in the past or the future. So if you just want to take a moment and feel your feet on the floor, and wherever you're sitting, if you'd like to sit up straight and lift your chest. And let's just slowly, if your arms will allow, and if you'd like to, just inhale the hands up and exhale them down to the heart center. Now let's just keep doing that. And again, we're linking breath to movement. Inhale. Exhale. And let's do that 2 more times. Inhale. Exhale. And 1 more. Inhale. Exhale. And let's just take the hands behind the back for a moment. And if that does, I'm going to make them like little angel wings. And we're going to round on the exhale and lift on the inhale. And that's a fairly intuitive breath. This is a little bit of cat and cow, if you've ever been to a yoga class before. And just notice, so this is a really reliable way to dissipate some tension that's in the spine. Now, if you're sitting in an armchair or a sort of a soft, cushy chair that sort of eats you up, it might be a little difficult to do this. So just a regular chair, stool. Inhale. Let's do 2 more. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. Last one. And even a small movement is fine. Good. Just let your hands relax. Just notice your arms. And let's just shake it out a little bit. There's a shaking practice there. We're just going to shake arms. And if your feet are available, you can shake your feet. And it's a gentle movement. And it's a very energizing movement. We're not probably going to do it long enough to realize that effect. But when we do this over the course of several minutes, there's it's a lovely sort of buzzing sensation. That's, I don't know, it beats caffeine, and you didn't have to pay $4 Starbucks or get jittery. So just a way to be able to energize yourself. So let's just slowly inhale and exhale. And again, inhale. Exhale. And just feel your hands on your heart for a moment if you'd like to. And just notice in this still, quiet space if you can actually feel your heart beating. Maybe you can just sense the heart beating. All that work that it's doing for you under, not with your awareness, it's underneath conscious awareness. It's just happening. Just let yourself be grateful. And perhaps gratitude arises. But don't feel like you have to manufacture it. Just notice if it's there. And I'm particularly grateful for this moment to share these practices with you at the end of a busy work week. Thank you.
Thank you. So actually we have a question from an audience member, Kathy Bowser, who I think this one will go well with some of what you just said, Joanne. She asks, how might you use these practices in a spiritual retreat for those who are spiritual retreat leaders, spiritual directors, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I am all, you probably know I'm also a spiritual director in the Christian Ignatian tradition. And one of the ways that I use these practices in spiritual direction that you could use in a retreat setting is I have found that people like therapy tend to spend a lot of time in their head. And sometimes even with our spiritual life, we can make it a cognitive experience and not a whole body experience. So using some of these practices helps us get in touch with all of the parts and helps us to integrate the fact that we are bodies. We don't just have bodies, we are bodies. Quoting from friend and best-selling author Tish Harrison Warren. And so these are practices that help us ground and feel the totality of our humanity. And so I think that's a very good place to be when you are on a spiritual retreat.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So another one that might go along with that question is from an anonymous attendee who asks, how do you select and weave music and or sound with yoga practices?
Yes, that's a great question. I do put that as in the setup in, I think that might be chapter 5 or 6. If I used to use music a lot, less so now. It's not terribly practical, or I'm seeing people with higher acuity where it might be competition, but I tend to use music, if I use any at all, in this, I think it's 60 to 90 beats per minute, usually something quiet, slow, instrumental. And that It depends on your audience, but it can be helpful or it can be distracting, and sometimes you have to try it out to see which is which. And sound, there's a whole very interesting area that I learned mostly in Life Force Yoga. And we use things like Bijou's sound seed mantras, and they are universal sounds. So for example, one of the practices in the book is an NG sound, and it goes something like inhale, and we NG tap this, like NG is a sound on the exhale, so the tongue's in the roof of the mouth. And these are sounds you'll find this vibration, it's making a particular vibration in the body. There's a whole body of work that supports of using toning and sound that has been very useful, particularly in mental health settings. There's some that are really energizing, like a rum, rum, rum. There's not a lot of that in the book, but I did touch on it in at least one of the practices. So it depends on who's in front of you, and it's something definitely worth exploring. And you'll find there are resources on the resource of different music that I have used in the practice using sounds, and I would refer yoga practitioners to Life Force Yoga for a more expanded version of all the possibilities of using sound in practice, because it's fascinating and I found it very helpful. But not everybody's ready for it. Just depends where the person is at on their journey as well.
So you're saying that some people are, the sound is too much for them to handle in addition to everything else. Like it's an overload, kind of an auditory overload in a certain way.
Possibly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have another question coming up, but I just want to encourage people who have questions to put them in the Q&A so that we can ask Joanne. You can get a lot of things answered that you might want to know about by asking now. So Joanne, someone you know has asked a question. His name is Lucas Spence. He has asked, who would most benefit from reading your book, and who would most benefit from utilizing the practices you have outlined in your book?
I'll give you $50 later, Luca. So my very first yoga studio was called Fitness Yoga for Everybody, because I felt like everybody that wanted could benefit from a very basic yoga practice. And I've learned over time and from many marketing strategists that you're not supposed to cater to everybody. So so it was with that in mind of learning that I needed to speak to a very specific audience. My undergraduate degree in Australia was in social work. And so for many, many years, I was a clinical social worker and working as a counselor and in group homes. And I realized that speaking to that audience that are predominantly using words in talk therapy was a sweet spot for me, with the background with the overlapping background and credentials that I had. So it was, that was a very specific and necessary way. Otherwise, I realized that there is some wisdom in that, even though I think yoga is for everybody, everybody that wants to be able to try breath and movement, that speaking to a specific audience was the only way I could actually write the book. Otherwise, it's very hard to focus the information and find a place for it to land and actually finish something. So therapists, counselors, and secondary audiences is yoga teachers, because it's not currently part of sort of an entry-level training in yoga, which is a 200-hour training. It's not, yoga is, the word trauma is only relates to like a trauma to like hurting a body part, not in the sense that I'm using the word. So I felt like maybe making, putting a flag in the ground and saying, I really think that this should be something included even in entry level yoga teaching. And then for spiritual directors, because that's a newer hat for me, there's some crossover, though it's different to being a therapist. But I've learned that bringing the body and bringing these practices into that profession has been it's been life-giving for me as a spiritual director, and I've gotten really good feedback from the people in front of me that have been brave enough to take me up on the offer of doing some breath work and some breath prayer and some movement and including that in their daily practices. But I really do believe, as many people that on the webinar that have dedicated their lives to the same thought, that that these practices are for anybody that wants to try them, and that this, if you can breathe, you can do yoga, is true. And there's me, and along with many people here who I've walked in their footsteps, have dedicated to reducing stereotypes in the West of yoga being for rich, white, bendy women. That's sort of perpetuated from within the industry itself, and certainly a cultural stereotype. And I believe that it should be available to anybody that wants to be able to try it, regardless of their size of their body, their ethnicity, their zip code. And I've tried to do their gender, tried to think about ways and places that the practices could be, and writing a book is one way to make it accessible in more places.
And I have to say, the book really does make it accessible. It really just, I mean, reading it again, I know I said this earlier, but it's really great. I mean, it's really well done. We have a question from Leslie. What are some things that yoga teachers might be doing in ordinary, quote, ordinary classes that are not trauma informed? How could we make all yoga classes trauma informed?
So the chapter for yoga teachers would be for you, Leslie. And if you're the Leslie, I think you are. Thank you for the question. And starting with invitation and giving people choices. And if you've been in the yoga community, you'll realize that there are sometimes very prescriptive classes where everybody has to be doing the same thing, and there isn't choice, or there's hands-on adjustment. And if you have training in that, it's one thing, but many people do not. And there's many minefields that need to be navigated. So I would say those is just very preliminary things of inviting people into the practice and having it be a warm, welcoming space, and being prepared to explain cueing differently for different learners, and being able to do that without doing hands-on adjustments. And these are just a few at the very beginning of the journey of understanding trauma-informed and being welcoming and hospitable. That's a couple of ways we can do that. So we're creating a safe container without saying that we're creating a safe container, and doing the work for ourselves so that we are in fact in ventral vagal, we are co-regulate, we are creating a space so that we can influence the neurobiology of being able to bring other people into our orbit in that way. So that means doing our own work and caring for ourselves and showing up in the space, with our own needs being met and having done our own work.
That came through in the story that you tell at one point about the young man in a detention center who, you were allowed in behind locked doors and a juvenile detention center and to do yoga. And he was kind of like, I don't have to do this, do I? And of course you're saying to us, the reader, I'm hoping that he will, but what's coming out of my mouth is, you get to choose. I mean, I would like for you to, but it's up to you to decide. And there are some other stories in there where I felt like that same approach came through in working with veterans, for instance, where people get to exert their own personal agency and also be invited. So there's a sense of hospitality in your yoga that I really appreciate, both as your student, but also as you're talking about it in the book, which is you invite people to a table, but you don't make them eat something they don't want to, eat. If they don't like, olives, you don't force an olive on them. Same thing with cat and cow or downward facing dog or any of the poses. So we have another question from an anonymous attendee. How does yoga help those with physical disabilities, such as a client who has nerve damage in a foot, which compromises balance, standing, and walking?
Yeah, so breathing practice, so there's a good chance there's a dysregulation of the nervous system when you have some things like that going on. And so this is kind of where I believe that yoga is for everybody. And an example of, I would routinely see people when we were seeing people in person, and I worked on the campus at one of our VA hospitals, the Heinz campus in Aspinwall here, not far from in Pittsburgh. I would often have people in wheelchairs or amputees that would have varying conditions and nerve pain and ghost pain. And my job wasn't to be doing physical therapy and doing something very specific for their movement, but my job was to be in the space running a therapeutic yoga group that they could find a way to participate in at their own level, and that they could feel present, that they could feel like they were learning a skill that helped them to regulate their nervous system. And the dysregulation might have come from many things, and may well have been as a result of some of the physical ailments that they had, that they were in their body. And sometimes it was mental health issues. So that's probably the best I could do in a sort of a generalized answer. And I really came kicking and screaming to, and it was a journey for me to understand that breathing wasn't a waste of time. I tell some of that story. Tell some of that story in the book, because I learned the theory, but I didn't get it experientially, and it took a little bit for that to happen. So I feel like I'm in the book, I'm writing somewhat for my younger self that didn't understand and didn't have the felt experience. And so I'm really compassionate for the people that go, what we're going to do? We're going to lift. I'm like, well, we could just give it a try. And mostly they do. I see very little resistance from the people in the classes that I teach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about, you've taught at the seminary and chair yoga at the seminary back pre-COVID, for instance, and there were people of varying levels of physical capability who were there for various reasons. And so, the adaptations of yoga that you were using in the chair were really interesting to me. I had been in a lot of Iyengar classes for years, and those are not always well, even though they're props, they're not well adapted, at least at the time, for many years they weren't. And so I was like, when you first started, when signs were put up for chair yoga, I was like, I don't know if I'm buying into this or not, but actually it is quite a great practice itself, and that people, you know, I mean, one of the things you say in the book multiple times is work in your pain-free, your pain-free range of motion, and be gentle, be slow, and that these things actually do have effect over time. That, you know, it's part of the thing I was thinking is that so many of us think we've got to rush it, like do it once and somehow, you know, magical things happen. But this is sort of, as my mother might say, slow and steady wins the race, in terms of actually helping with healing on various levels. That it takes time, and the slow and sort of thoughtful movement and breath are what actually do the work for you. So you're not like actually running ahead of yourself trying to make it happen, so to speak.
Yeah. And speaking of mothers, I wanted to just acknowledge my mom and her husband, Ken, who are on the webinar from Australia. It's Saturday morning, very early. And I wanted to make it practices that she could do and be able to relate to. So that was one of my goals in doing that. And I think I achieved that. So
You did. Okay, at least for me. So we have another question from an anonymous attendee. Do you recommend that a practicing yoga therapist also be in therapy through yoga and/or talk therapy? And if so, why?
Yes, I do. In fact, I think one of the things that I got from being a spiritual director, learning to be a spiritual director, was that one would be in spiritual direction for as long as you're a spiritual director. And I recommend that as a practice for anybody that's got a faith journey. But even before that, in social work and growing up in the 70s and training in the 80s in Australia, it wasn't something that we talked about a lot. I think there's a renewal of talking about the need to care for ourselves. And as Dr. Leanna Fuller from the Seminary says, self-care is not selfish. And so I see my own practice of yoga therapy and my own therapeutic relationships that I have with my therapist as absolutely part of my own self-care, just as I go to see my chiropractor or my acupuncturist. And sometimes my massage therapist couldn't be here today because she was working. These are not luxury items. These are absolutely essential things that I need to do to care for myself, to be well enough to do the work that I'm doing. And that's not particular to me as a yoga therapist. I think that applies to anybody in the service industry. Of how we show up is essential. And I used to think that maybe I would get to a point of not needing those things anymore. And more recently, I realized that there is always work to do. And there might be some seasons that I might do more of some particular work with one of my particular people in my wellness team for any, various reasons, whether it's physical pain that I'm feeling in my own body from my journey of coming out of chronic pain from several car accidents, and my own mental health journey of recovering from depression and noticing the things in my life that may trigger that. So I think it's essential, and I'm hoping that practitioners will use the book as a way to care for themselves and establish the practice. And if it's hard to do it on your own as a self-study, that there are resources in the book of people to connect to that, and certainly can contact me for referrals to be able to find trauma therapists and people that specialize in whatever it is that you need. I'm happy to be a connector.
So we've only got a few minutes left, about 6 minutes. And I have a question I'd like to ask before we wrap up, which is, you and I met when you were finishing up your MA at PTS. And you talked a little bit about this, but I wondered if you could unpack a little bit more about the connections between your yoga practice and your work as a spiritual director, trained in Ignatian methods, and ways that you are continuing to work on integrating yoga into your own faith journey for those who are here from PTS or from other faith traditions and are especially curious about that line and your own journey.
I think probably the best way to answer that, and some of that I answered earlier with the person that asked how you might use this in a spiritual retreat, that would apply here too. But I think these practices that are in the book and the things that I've learned from my yoga journey have helped me in my faith journey and have helped me to be able to be still and quiet and to be listening for that still small voice. As a Christian, my prayer life, I just thought that there was the words, the prayers that you spoke with words. And I didn't understand that you could pray with your body, that you could pray in silence. And yoga has given me a way, and these practices in particular, given me a way to be able to find stillness when I was anything but. And I would just feel guilty in praying of a laundry list of things I would say when I realized I could actually be still and be focused and apply the tools that I learned and be able to meditate. I had not found those in my denominational traditions that I had been associated with, and I found those on a yoga mat. So if you have trouble focusing or you really want to be attentive and learn to meditate in your faith tradition and really be able to sit in God's presence and not feel distracted and overwhelmed by that, then these practices will help you to do that. And there are many other practices in the spiritual tradition and things that I learned in Dr. Owen's class in spiritual formation and all sorts of prayer forms. And I find, walking is a spiritual practice for me, but predominantly it's been these practices that have helped me find that place of stillness that was very elusive for a long time.
Interesting. Well, thank you for that. And I wondered right before we close up, if you have any closing thoughts or advice you'd like to leave the audience with, this global audience that has assembled to celebrate your book.
Well, I'm really humbled and honored that you're here to hear about the book and the practices today. So thank you so much for taking some time out of a Friday afternoon or Friday evening, Saturday morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you. And I'd be delighted if you would get the book and read it, but I would be more delighted if you actually put the practices into action and make it part of your life, or just to try them on to see the effect that it has on your nervous system. And that's really the point. It's not just the reading, but it's the doing, and then sharing that with somebody else. And that would be my greatest desire from somebody getting the book, would be to put it into practice and to share it with somebody.
Thank you. And I want to not only thank Joanne for her time and her generosity in writing the book and sharing it with us, but also encourage you to check out the library guide, which is in the chat as a link, that you can see all sorts of resources that Joanne has provided and that we also have in our library. Also, check out City Books or bookshop.org to buy a copy of the book. We're getting some congratulations, Joanne, to you in the chat box from a variety of different people. And so they're all coming in. We'll have a record of that, Joanne, so that you can see them. So I won't speak them all right now so that we can wrap up on time. But I do want to thank all of you for joining us. It is such a joy to me to get a chance to have this conversation with Joanne, and you all of being here have helped make that possible. We will have some upcoming book talks that'll be announced on our website coming up in the next month or so. We'll be having Dr. Jerome Creech, who is one of our Old Testament professors, who's just written a fascinating book on the Psalms. So I'll be having a conversation with him. And we've got some other people lined up to join us, and we've got to get all the dates worked out. So, and hopefully someday we'll be having Joanne back for another book. But Joanne, don't feel like you have to rush quite yet. I know you've got to just enjoy this one. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to Michelle Spomer and to IT. It's been a joy to spend this time with all of you. And Joanne, again, a hearty congratulations on a job very well done. Thank you for your book.
Thanks for having me, and thank you so much for joining us wherever you are in the world. And I just send my heartfelt thanks and love to all of you. Mwah.
Bye. Have a nice evening, everyone.